Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in AP English, and we turn now in our study of the World of Ideas text to lecture number 4, Machiavelli's Prince. Now, of course, we can argue this is maybe some of the most famous or infamous political theory in the history of political theory. Now, here's the deal. I've already given a series of comments on Machiavelli's Prince in the AP folder on learnstrong.net. You can find this as well placed in the World of Ideas folder. And I'm going to work off of the assumption that the comments that I make here are following your study of those comments. So if you have not looked at that material in a while or at all, then I very much recommend that you do so, okay? Now, think of this. In AP, we continually say this. We are the stories that we tell, the stories we retell, the stories we accept, and the stories we reject. This is going to be one of those moments in our study when we're going to have to ask a very thorny, difficult question. The ideas that Machiavelli presents about what it means to be a good leader, to be a good governor, are these ideas stories that we're going to accept or to reject? And of course, as I've said many times, we can't really reject a concept until we understand the concept. So let's take a look at our ideas here from Machiavelli. Again, the Prince, we've already seen this once, but now we're going to begin to look a little bit more in detail, especially at the rhetorical techniques that Machiavelli will use. Now, our question goes all the way back to our early study of Plato and the Republic. Again, you can see those lectures in learnstrong.net in the AP folder. The question is, who or what is the ideal leader, right? Here, in many ways, we're going to have the antithesis, to use Hegelian language, the opposite of what Lao Tzu is going to argue in the Tao Te Ching about what makes a great leader. Here, we're going to return to the Thrasymachon argument from Republic Book 1. Now, if you, again, are not aware or familiar with the Thrasymachon argument, then you'll want to pause this video and you want to go and take a look at our comments on Plato's Republic, especially Book 1. The Thrasymachon argument is simply might makes right. The idea that the guy or the gal with the biggest gun is the one that wins, that politics is all about power and the manipulation of power. Well, we're going to hear something about might makes right, obviously, in Machiavelli's Prince. Now, several assumptions here. The first is that you have been following our earlier lectures 1 through 3, and I'm going to build so much in this lecture on those earlier lectures as well as our earlier Machiavelli Prince lectures in learnstrong.net. Of course, our learning through, we always talk about it, that desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways, and our 3 levels of reading, our annotative work and active reading, engaging in a form of a dialogue. Let's make sure we do that in our study here as well. At level 1, this is hypercritical, because Lao Tzu was poetry. Here, we're definitely looking now to practice our paragraph summarizing. I'll be looking in your notes to make sure that we have the summary of the paragraphing as we go through this. At 2A, if at level 1 we're asking about summary, at level 2 we're asking how can I understand meanings and understandings of this. At 2A, our big 5, again, what does this text say about epistemology, hypercritical, the study of knowledge? What does this text say about ontology and who we are? It's going to be a pretty dark view of human nature. Psychology and the manipulation of fear and anxiety, we're going to hear about that. Sociology, this is an important sociological text. And then finally, and I think maybe most importantly, and often misunderstood in the reading of the Prince, theodicy, the existence of evil and the power and the importance of suffering and evil in the world in which we live. As we get into this study, we'll see this very, very importantly. Just back to our sociological and ontological understandings, Machiavelli will say in The Prince, he who builds on the people builds on mud. In other words, you can't trust people. The view of human nature is going to be very, very dark here. Finally, at level 3A, we're going to relate this to, obviously, Lao Tzu, we've already mentioned that, and to the other theorists in the government section of World of Ideas, as well as a number of other theorists. And then at 3B, we're going to end with some maybe disturbing questions. I mean, it's a fascinating question to ask. Do you want a president that's really good at lying, or do you want a president that always tells the truth? See, our instincts are to say, no, I want a president that always tells the truth. Do you? Because, I mean, think about it. There's the president standing in front of the press corps. And one in the press corps says, is it true that we are about to attack some place? Do you want the president to actually say, yes we are, we're sending in right now troops, and therefore jeopardizing those troops? Or do you want that president to say, absolutely not, at the very moment that it's happening? That is a very difficult question, and one that I think Machiavelli will demand that we ask. Now, why do we say this is an infamous text? Well, this text sat on the nightstand, supposedly, of Adolf Hitler through most of his political career. That should tell us something, but maybe not everything. And remember, we've said that sometimes books and texts can be misread. So we'll have to ask about Machiavelli's Prince and the ways in which the book has maybe been read well or misread. Let's do some quick biography stuff just from our Jacobus text. The dates again, 1469 to 1527. Again, an easy working date for Machiavelli in your mind, if you just want to lock it in your brain, is 1500. 1500 will work rather nicely for us. Florentine Medici princes are going to be out of power for a number of years, and then they will come back into power at 1512. 18 years they've been banished, and Machiavelli will be suspected of state crimes, although not guilty, and ultimately will find his way back into the good graces of the Medici. While he is in exile, because the Medicis have put him there, he will sit down to write The Prince. 1513 is our important date here, where he's going to contrast two kinds of forces, as we talk about it in our earlier lecture. Luck, what he sometimes calls his fortune or fortuna, and character or virtue, right? And there's tension between these two things, right? Now, The Prince is a treatise on how to govern, be a good prince, a good leader, written to the Medicis, all right, about the qualities of a great prince. His attempt is not just to get into the good graces of the Medicis and to be returned, but to save Italy, especially from the French and the Spaniards, okay? Now, The Prince, as we say in our earlier lecture, is all about the break. That is to say, philosophically, the argument against the idealism of Plato and the Republic. This is what we will call the is-ought dichotomy, right? And the way that the world actually is. Machiavelli will make it very clear. I am not interested in talking about the way the world ought to be. We would all love to live in a world where everybody gets Scooby snacks all the time. But Scooby snacks are an illusion. And because they're an illusion, let's talk about the way the world actually is. That's what we mean by the is-ought dichotomy. That's what we mean by the break. And in many ways, this will be the birth of modern political theory, no question. It is a pragmatic, practical view of politics and political theory based on history. And that's a key, because Lao Tzu would say, well, my approach is a practical, very practical approach. But Machiavelli would argue is, yeah, but all the way through my text, I'm going to give historical examples. Do we have historical examples in the Tao Te Ching? We don't. Do we have historical examples in Plato's Republic? We pointed it out in our lectures. We don't. That's theory. Machiavelli will say, I'm not interested in theory, I'm interested in the way the world really actually works. Realism, or realpolitik, is often the phrase is used. So, in the argument here, the prince might have to use might. That is to say, power. So, it's not actually the Thrasymachon argument of might makes right. It's more about strategic use of might. And I would put that word in my notes. Strategic use of might to be able to accomplish the political goals. What is ironic, and we said this in our earlier lecture on Machiavelli, is that Machiavelli wants to do exactly the same thing that Plato wants to do. To somehow secure, sociologically, a political kind of establishment that will bring about peace, harmony, safety, security. We've already said, especially against the French and the Spaniards. How you get there, the modus operandi, that's the real question as we will enter now our study of Machiavelli's Prince. And it's built in large measure, okay, ontologically, it's built in large measure on Machiavelli's view of human nature. And it's a pretty cynical view. It says humans are a pretty disgusting lot. And because humans are a pretty disgusting lot, you have to govern them in a certain kind of way. Now, it seems that Lao Tzu and Socrates will have a different view of human nature. They have a much more elevated view of human nature. Machiavelli can't share this view of human nature. And in this regards, we'll find him somewhat similar with Dante, and go back to our earlier comments on Dante in the ND folder at LearnStrong.net. Now, when on page 34, you take a look at the rhetoric that will be emphasized here, we're going to immediately identify this is less poetic than Lao Tzu. It's more practical. It's more direct. It's prose as well, right? The consideration of the historical precedent is huge. Write that term down. We're going to find this term again in our study of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. What do we mean? Well, we mean that if you're going to hold a certain kind of political view, it needs to be rooted in an understanding of history, historical precedent. In other words, what has worked in the past? As you read the Prince, not just our cutting here, and my hope is that your reading of the cutting here will lead you to want to read the entire text of the Prince. As you read the Prince, you'll notice how many times he references great leaders. One of his greatest, Moses. What makes Moses a great leader? He knows how to manipulate power. He knows how to gain the upper hand and keep the upper hand. We'll have more to say about this, obviously, in our study. To that degree, the rhetorical technique we're really paying attention to in our study here, write it down, it's hypercritical, is comparison-contrast, right? That is to say, we want to pay attention to the way Machiavelli does this so that we can become more literate in our study of all kinds of propaganda, all kinds of literary texts, and in our own writing as well. I've made the argument before that to be a good writer, you have to be a good reader. Machiavelli will actually help us in this regard. Watching how he does this, you'll never look at advertising the same way. Watching how he does this, you'll never listen to leaders in their speeches the same way. Watching how he does this, you'll obviously improve as a writer as well. Now, one of the things we want to put in our notes, rhetorically speaking, is that Machiavelli loves the aphorism. These little short sayings. For example, it is much safer to be feared than to be loved. It's a compelling little aphorism. Or, he who builds on the people builds on mud. The power of these aphorisms is they come across as epistemological certainty. We could almost say an absolute. That is to say, Machiavelli argues, I am absolutely certain he who builds on the people or trusts the people builds on mud. You will pay in the long run for trusting the people. Or it's much safer to be feared than it is to be loved. No question, that's an absolute epistemological certainty. There's no fallibilism there. And you're going to see less epistemological fallibilism here than you saw in your study of the Tao Te Ching. The last paragraph on page 35 is, I think, a compelling statement of the aphorism. So just read it with me. Aphorisms, these definite statements, have several important qualities. One is that they are pithy. They seem to say a great deal in a few words. Another is that they appear to contain a certain deal of wisdom, in part because they're delivered with such certainty, epistemological certainty is what we were saying, and in part because they have the ring of other aphorisms that we accept as true. Because they sound like aphorisms, they gain a claim to, notice, unsubstantiated truth. And we tend to accept them with much more readily than perhaps we should. This may be why the speeches of contemporary politicians, modern versions of the Prince, are often sprinkled with such expressions and illustrate why Machiavelli's rhetorical technique is still reliable, still effective, still worth studying, as we just said. Now, there is no question that this kind of work is going to be important for us in our study. Now, here we only have 6 sections, okay, of our study. We need to scan, as good readers do, as we said, good readers do this. Scan the organization really quickly, so let's do this. You have 28 paragraphs, so I'm going to expect that your notes of this reading will in fact be a paragraph summary of 28 paragraphs. Again, that's hypercritical in our study here. Let's work now through each section. We want to pay attention to the footnotes, which are going to help with the historical references. That's that historical precedent that maybe is less known to us. Certainly the Medici, and Machiavelli wrote this text assuming that the readers of the Medici would know their history, and there's no question that's a significant comment. We'll even get to maybe a comment of his about the study of history. I think, you know, we sometimes get this question, obviously, in the humanities, what's the real point of it? Machiavelli says, I'll tell you the real point of it, because there's no point in science if you don't know history and the science of history, because that's central. Well, one more reason to be reminded of the great Santayana's saying, those who forget the past are damned to repeat it. Machiavelli would have agreed with an idea like that. Now, just because you know the past doesn't mean that you don't repeat it either, but Machiavelli will give some interesting arguments. First, let's look at the first heading, a prince's duty concerning military matters. This will be paragraphs 1 through 6, so you're going to see that as a block, although I want you guys in your note-taking to work paragraph by paragraph. Here we're going to hear right away A prince, therefore, must not have any other object, nor any other thought, nor must he take anything as his profession, but war, its institutions and its discipline. Because that is the only profession which befits one who commands. And it is of such importance that not only does it maintain those who were born princes, but many times it enables men of private station to rise to that position. And on the other hand, it's evident that when princes have given more thought to personal luxuries than to arms, they have lost their state. Go back and look at our comments on Beowulf, Part 2, and that famous speech at the conclusion of Beowulf 2, when Hrothgar says to Beowulf, be careful about luxury. When you amass great amounts of luxury, you think that peace is sustainable forever, and you will begin to lose the memory of warfare. Certainly a very Machiavellian view. And the first way to lose it, that is to say, to lose their state, is to neglect this art. So here notice politics is understood as art. And the way to acquire it is to be well versed in this art. The prince's sole concern, war. Its institutions, its discipline. An unarmed man is unsafe and despised among armed men, even in peacetime. A prince has to keep his body, his mind in shape for war, studying terrain, strategy, the history of successful commanders. I'm on page 36 at paragraph 3. The great leader, the prince, must therefore never raise his thought from this exercise of war. And in peacetime, he must train himself more than in time of war. This can be done in two ways, one by action, the other by the mind. As far as actions are concerned, besides keeping his soldiers well disciplined and trained, he must always be out hunting and must accustom his body to hardships in this manner. Obviously, a number of us spend time on the hill doing this, so we can appreciate what he's saying here. And he must also learn the nature of the terrain and know how mountains slope, how valleys open, how plains lie, and understand the nature of rivers and swamps. He should devote much attention to such activities. Such knowledge is useful in two ways. First, one learns to know one's own country and better understand how to defend it. Second, with the knowledge and experience of the terrain, one can easily comprehend the characteristics of any other terrain that is necessary to explore for the first time. By the way, Sun Tzu said the same thing in his classic text, Art of War, as did the famous samurai fighter Musashi in the Japanese Book of Five Rings. You have the same kind of argument that is being made here as well. This passage will finish, this section will finish, as for the exercise of the mind, on page 37. This is paragraph 5. As for the exercise of the mind, the prince must read histories, and in them study the deeds of great men. Notice, Plato was interested in math. He who knows no geometry, enter not here, he had above his university academy. Here, notice for Machiavelli, it isn't so much math and science. You better know history and the way in which people have conducted themselves. The deeds of great men. The argument Machiavelli will make is, you better know your biographies, right? He must see how, the prince, must see how these great leaders conducted themselves in wars. He must examine the reasons for their victories and for their defeats, in order to avoid the latter and to imitate the former. And above all else, he must do as some distinguished men before him has done, who elected to imitate someone who had been praised and honored before him, and always keep in mind his deeds and actions. We think of Plutarch's Lives, and in fact, the great are mentioned there, Caesar, Achilles, obviously Alexander the Great is going to be one of the greatest exemplars, right? And in so doing, one will then become prepared for leadership, okay? Our second section, number 2, on page 37, on those things which men, and particularly princes, are praised and blamed. Here, we're going to hear that to hold the position, a prince has to be realistic rather than idealistic. He's got to learn how to be good. He's got to avoid reputation of vice, except for those vices that he needs to hold his state. For example, it's lying is a vice, and living in a perfect world, we would never want to lie. But sometimes he says the prince has to know how to manipulate the truth for the greater good, would be Machiavelli's argument. The third category part on generosity and miserliness is for us then paragraphs 9 through 11. Here we're going to hear that the prince has to consider generosity, okay? You got to display generosity, except in looting and sacking with his soldiers. If the prince who displays generosity will lose his wealth and the regard of his subjects. He is wiser to maintain the resources he needs to defend against armies and enemies and be thought a miser than to become poor or known for being greedy. I'm on page 40 in paragraph number 11, right at the end of paragraph number 11. It reads something like this. After mentioning people like Caesar and Alexander, he says it this way. There is nothing that uses itself up faster than generosity. For as you employ it, you'll lose the means of employing it, and you become either poor or despised, or in order to escape poverty, rapacious and hated. And above all other things, a prince must guard himself against being despised and hated. This, of course, was said as well by Lao Tzu. And generosity leads you to both one and the other. So it's wiser to live with the reputation of a miser, which produces reproach without hatred, than to be forced to incur the reputation of rapacity, which produces reproach along with hatred, because you want to be considered as generous. The fourth section on cruelty and mercy, and whether it's better to be loved than to be feared, or the contrary. Now, this one is paragraphs 12 through 18. And here we're going to hear that a little judicious, strategic cruelty shows more compassion than excessive mercy, which permits disorder. A prince has to be cautious, but decisive, and it's safer being feared than loved. He should take lives when necessary, but he should never earn his subjects' hatred by taking their property or women, even during warfare. And of course, we have examples in The Prince of how this can be done. Better to be feared than to be loved. Let's just read a little bit about this on page 41, paragraph 13, 14, and following. Nevertheless, a prince must be cautious in believing and in acting, nor should he be afraid of his own shadow, and he should proceed in such a manner tempered by prudence and humanity,